Chapter 5. Noguchi left her apartment early so she could catch Hiroki before he made rounds. The corporation employees' living quarters were all in the same building as the offices and mess hall, along with the community center and central operations. Narrow passageways connected this building to the equipment storage and the main garage. To the east and south was open range. To the north, mountains, and west was Iowa Gorge, a canyon too deep and long to herd the Rinth, although it certainly kept them from wandering too far in that direction. One less fence to build. Noguchi walked through the connecting hall and saw one of the geotechs headed towards her, a thin, older man with brown skin and very little hair. His name was... Hin? As they passed, she made a conscious effort to smile and nod at the man. He seemed vaguely surprised but returned the courtesy, his teeth a sharp contrast to his dark face. A condescending voice spoke in her head. That wasn't too hard, now was it? Noguchi made a mental note to check the personnel files that evening. She felt almost embarrassed. 6 months, and she didn't even know the people she was supposed to be working with. All of that was going to change. Noguchi had started to realize just how little she had seen of Prosperity Wells. She had, of course, spent time learning the layout of the complex when she'd first arrived. It was an efficient setup. A med center with helipad. There were quarantine and holding pens for the Rinth, a transmitter communications control shack, and a school connected to a rec center. There was also a fairly decent, if very small, shopping mall, complete with 2 tiny restaurants and a bar. Not that any of these got much use. Only the company people lived in the wells, although most of the ranchers were in walking distance, if you didn't mind a long and hot hike. If it wasn't Earth, at least it was an attempt to make something that was like a town. There were hardly enough people in the gene pool to turn the planet into anything civilized, and even with more settlers, it wasn't likely to ever be a major population center. Still, the company had made a token effort to make it look like home. But besides seeing an occasional holovid at the Rex Theatre, she hadn't really been a member of the community. It wasn't her home, and she wasn't going to stay here any longer than it took to show a profit and shine in the company's eyes, at least enough to earn a transfer to the next rung on the ladder. But Hiroki was right. She would have to do what was necessary to earn the spot, and so far she had remained as insulated as a thermetic bottle. And the lector would be arriving in less than 72 hours. So I imagine everyone will welcome me with open arms and songs of greeting now that I'm finally ready, hey? Right. As she walked between shelves piled high with bike and copter parts, she heard voices from the direction of the open entryway into the yard. She could make out the distinct soft tone of Hiroki's voice among the others. He sounded irritated. Noguchi slowed her pace to catch the gist of the conversation she was about to walk into. Not the point, Hiroki. The company's making a killing from our sweat, and we're getting screwed. Right, Ackland? That's the way the Ranchers Association sees it. Noguchi waited just inside the door to listen for another moment. Several ranchers and Hiroki stood in a loose circle several meters away. She could just see the edge of Ackland's heavy Rinth hide coat, which he wore even on the hottest day. He was a large, opinionated man who had an amazing ability to cause friction. I don't even know why I'm discussing this with you, said Hiroki. Ms. Noguchi is in charge now. You should be talking to her. A perfect cue. Noguchi stepped forward and through the entry. That bitch? She doesn't give a shit about us, said Ackland. Maybe if she got laid once in a while, started one of the other ranchers, Rick Harrison. Anybody who tried would freeze his dick off, said one of Ackland's men. The group chuckled, all except for Hiroki. Harrison broke off abruptly when he spotted her striding towards them. He coughed suddenly into his hand. Miss Noguchi, he said. His voice was loud. She held her head high and stared at him. He dropped his gaze, as did the other men. Only Ackland had the nerve to meet her eyes. I thought we were in the middle of a roundup, gentlemen, she said, voice cool. Hiroki stepped in. We were just discussing the agreement their association has already signed. Ackland tapped his pipe with the heel of one hand. That was before we saw what the market was doing back on Earth. If we'd have known the price of meat was going to jump like this, we'd have asked for more. And if the bottom had fallen out of the market, would you have offered to take less? Said Hiroki. All eyes turned to Noguchi. She faced Ackland, obviously the man to negotiate with. I'll talk to the company and see if I can swing a larger cut for your ranchers, she said. We want to be fair. Ackland nodded and tugged at his dirty red beard. He opened his mouth to speak, but Noguchi cut him off. But there won't be anything for anyone if your Rinth aren't ready for shipment when the lector arrives. She noted his flash of annoyance with smug satisfaction. No matter what she changed, Ackland was never going to be a man she enjoyed working with. I suggest you get back to your jobs. She smiled at the others as they followed Ackland across the yard. Hiroki raised his eyebrows at her after the ranchers had reached a safe distance. Pleasant man, Ackland, he said blandly. Perhaps someday we'll marry, she said, keeping a straight face. Hiroki grinned. Let's saddle up, said Noguchi. She shaded her eyes against the sun's and looked out at the open plain. I'm ready to get some rinse shit between my toes. Words of wisdom, said Hiroki. Noguchi nodded and then walked with Hiroki towards the hoverbikes. Already she felt as if she'd set wheels in motion, and once started, there would be no turning back. The young male stood in standard formation and watched the Shunde expectantly. The Kirite stank of musk, and the air was alive with tension. He had made them wait long enough. It was time. The Shunde looked at the heaps of armor and weaponry that Skente and Walker had lined up against the wall. You may collect your awa assa, he said, waving at the armor. Now. With passionate cries of excitement, the Oucher ran to the piles of equipment and hard meat shell, shoving and kicking to get there first. There was enough to suit all of them, of course, but they would fight for the better trappings. The stronger males would get the prime supplies. That was always the way. The Shunde watched as the Oucher strapped on the scarred platings and struggled for arm sheaths and masks. Shafted knives were weighed and measured, burners' sights checked. Medkits and multiple eyes weren't standard for young males' armor, nor were Tere Hassan loops. Only the warriors used such additions. There was shift capacity in a few of the suits, but the young males would not need such things anyway. The first hunt was more of a matter of point and kill than tracking and hiding. Invisibility was generally reserved for prey that shot back. You had to earn the right to use the better gear, and the prey for which it was necessary. It was still 2 nights until landing on the seeded world, but the Oucher would need to become accustomed to their awa assa, to feel comfortable with the movement and weight. The Shunde himself had slept in his armor the first night he had donned it. They had worn the gear only briefly during their training and under strict supervision. For this there were reasons, the main being that a young male given too much power too early was a hazard to himself and others. Turn some of the wet behind-the-knees younglings loose with a burner, even a few weeks ago, and there would have been a risk of holes in the ship's hull, or bodies piled in the corridors. The ceiling of the firing range had more scars than a ceremonial blood pig. The Shunde watched Tishinde backhand a smaller male for the mask he held, and hiss triumphantly at the gain. The leader nodded thoughtfully. Tishinde was strong, but reckless. Such recklessness could get him killed. Did he survive, however, he could be a great warrior and a credit to his teacher. It was far better to be brave and die than to be cowardly and survive by hiding from the Black Warrior. Songs were not sung about those who showed their back to an attack. One by one, the dressed Yautja held up their shafted knives and howled to each other, pointing their burners to the floor and pretending to fire in mock battle. Skente caught the Shunde's gaze and growled amusement at their fervour. The The Shande nodded and echoed the growl. Doubtless, each of the would-be warriors thought himself the bravest to have ever picked up a spear and waved it. The young males were as ready as he could make them. He hoped they were ready enough. If they were not, it was too late, and too bad. Their successes or failures would start soon on the planet now speeding towards them. The Taikai, the Te Sade Naun Gakon, the Te Naun Bipide. The fight begun would not end until the end. A tired saying, but a true one. The hunt was about to begin.